And then we can start with tonight's talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to welcome all of you to tonight's talk, Gone Viral, Vaccine and Drug Development as a Global Effort in Germany and the US. To our panel discussion, actually. My name is Micha Himpel. I'm the Culture Program Manager of the German-American Institute here in Tübingen. And before we start, first of all, I would like to thank, of course, and also welcome all of you in the name of the Technologieförderung Reutlingen-Tübingen, especially Christine Decker, as well as the Weltethos Institute and Bernd Villhauer, our two cooperation partners who organized this talk together with us. And well, without them, this talk would not have been possible. Thank you so much. And we're happy for the great collaboration. And we're together, all of us are looking forward to this evening's event. From our side, I want to keep it short. If you want to see and learn more about us, the German-American Institute in Tübingen, feel free to check out our events via YouTube, our homepage, or you can follow us on almost all social media. And we offer language courses, TOEFL tests, kids programs, as well as travels. Just want to point out to our New York City trip this October. And made possible. Let's keep our fingers crossed that it's going to be possible. And we have a lovely exhibition right now, fits to the topic. It's COVID-19, Faces of Resilience, beautiful photographies by Claudia Paul from New York. She's a German-born photographer living in New York, and she took some great pictures at the Mount Sinai Hospital during the lockdown, the first lockdown in New York last March. So if you're interested, come and visit us. It's possible right now, but you can also see the whole exhibit online. And yeah, well, I hope that our trip to New York will be possible, but we're optimistic due to widespread vaccination programs and vaccination developments in regard to fighting COVID-19. And this brings us already to the topic of tonight. Again, our panel discussion, Gone Viral, Vaccine and Drug Development as a Global Effort in Germany and the US. Tonight, our panelists will have a deeper look at viruses in general. Where do they come from and what are the differences between them? We'll discuss the most efficient ways in fighting virus diseases, such as, well, COVID-19. And we'll analyze the current status of vaccine developments, vaccine funding, and the current implications on the more and more emerging biotech sector, always both in Germany and the US. Our panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Siegfried Bialoyan, and I would love to briefly introduce Mr. Bialoyan to you. Dr. Siegfried Bialoyan received his PhD from the University of Heidelberg in molecular biology and human medicine. And after that, he worked as a senior scientist at the German Cancer Research Center in Heidelberg, with a focus on cell biology research. Until 1996, he was a senior scientist and lab leader at BASF in Ludwigshafen. And until 2001, at BASF Pharma, he did drug discovery research, drug screening, and drug development. Until May this year, he worked as executive director and head of Ernst & Young Life Science Center in Mannheim. And there, he was in charge of the Life Science Knowledge Platform. He conducted global industry surveys and annual life science industry analysis. He provided input to Ernst & Young's biotech and medtech through leadership reports. And in addition, he assisted advisory client projects as an industry expert. After retiring from Ernst & Young, he's focusing on his profession as a biotech expert. And I'd love to end with a quote by himself. After retiring from Ernst & Young, I'm still motivated to stay engaged in the biotech sector with focus on innovation and professional translation of science into commercial value creation. I'm more than happy that he and all our other panelists are here tonight, and we're all looking forward to an inspiring and interesting evening. I hand over to you, Mr. Bialoyan. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Also, welcome from my side. Far too long list of my CV. You know, that's the downside if you are such an old guy. But anyway, we'll just start or continue with the introduction first of our panelists tonight. I'm very happy to have three experts here on my panel today. Let's start with the one furthest away. The longest distance has Adam Lauring from Michigan. Adam, maybe you say a few words on yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. So yes, I'm Adam Lauring. I'm on the faculty at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor, your sister city. And I am an infectious disease physician and a virologist, and my research interests are in the evolution and epidemiology of viral infections.
So we have heard a lot these days, about virologists. Every other second, there's somebody of your profession on TV now. So now we have you tonight, and we have two more experts on the panel. Let's just continue because I see you on one row here, Oliver.
Hi, my name is Oliver Planz. I'm a biologist by training, and I hold a professorship at the University of Tübingen for cell biology and immunology. And I also function as a CSO for the company Atriva Therapeutics, which developed an antiviral drug against COVID-19.
Okay, and then last but by far not least, Ralf, I think you have very interesting additions to that topic, but just say a few words on yourself first.
Yes. Hi, good evening, and thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Ralf Amann. I'm also a biologist by training. I'm a group leader at the Institute of Immunology at the University Hospital in Tübingen, and also CEO of Prime Vector Technologies. And also in our company, we are developing a vaccine against COVID-19. And therefore, yes, I'm really looking forward for this discussion.
Yeah, I will come back to all the topics you are focusing on. But let's just first start. I think the audience we have is pretty broad. That's what I assume. So let's just really introduce a little bit into the topic, talking about what are viruses at all, what kind of creatures they are. Oliver, maybe you want to give it a start?
Let me try to give a start. So maybe you think that viruses are small and round. They're really small, but they differ in sizes. And of course, they are not round. They have different shapes. Most of them are round, that's true. But some are like, have a bullet shape. Some have a shape like a worm. So they are different in sizes, they are different in shapes, and they also have different kind of genetic material. They have RNA and they have DNA. And we have viruses that infect us and gone away after a couple of weeks. You can say it's a hit and run. We call it acute infection viruses. But we have also viruses that persist or live in our bodies for years or even for our whole life. These are viruses that persistently infect us or leading to so-called chronic infections.
That's fine. Ralf, maybe you want to continue. I mean, the problems is we have different types of viruses, right? And what does this have to do with their molecular consistency? How are they built up? Oliver already mentioned RNA and DNA. How relevant is that?
You mean from a vaccine perspective? So there is some relevance for sure, but so that's not our main focus. Yeah, if it's an RNA-based virus or DNA-based virus. So our main focus is really how they infect the host and how they evade the immune system. So these are two main focuses for our vaccine development. And in addition, which antigens, so the genes a virus consists of, are most accessible for the immune response. These are all things that we consider when we are designing a vaccine against a viral infection.
Maybe we should add for the very general introduction that viruses as such are not animals. It's just creatures that can only survive by replicating in cells, in animal cells. That's the peculiar thing about them. And I think this has also relevance for the treatment that we are talking afterwards. But as Oliver already mentioned, viruses are kind of connected to diseases. And I think that has become very obvious now, of course, with the coronavirus. That's pretty clear. But Adam, maybe you want to expand a little bit into diseases that we know since very long, because Corona is only around for almost, well, not quite 2 years, 1.5 years. Maybe you can allude to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think as others have highlighted and hinted, there's a broad variety of viruses, and there are some viruses that you barely even know you have, that they don't even, they can be with you, and the virus is in you, but it doesn't cause you any problems. There are viruses that cause, mild, sort of acute diseases like Oliver discussed, like the common cold. So you get a runny nose and a sneeze, but that's about it. And then there are some viruses that will, of course, cause more serious acute diseases, things like measles or polio, or and then, of course, COVID. And then there are viruses that cause severe diseases over a long time frame. And so viruses like HIV or hepatitis C virus or hepatitis B virus, and these can be with you for a long time and then gradually cause disease. And then there's viruses that are with you for a long time, but usually aren't a problem, but sometimes do cause problems. And so viruses like herpes viruses, so people can cause cold sores every now and then, but then every now and then can cause a very serious disease. But the virus kind of pops up, causes a disease, and then goes down, but it's still with you over time. And so, not surprisingly, given all the different kinds of viruses, there are all sorts of different types of viral diseases and how severe they are, and who they're severe in adults or children. And I think we've seen aspects of all of this with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 as well.
But I think it's clear for everybody here, and especially for people in Tübingen, we don't have to explain that. I mean, I think that's the story of that is going around, especially in cities like Tübingen quite a bit. But there hasn't been a virus disease that I remember, maybe with the exception of HIV, that has been so intensely affected not only people, but really the whole globe. I mean, it's spreading around, and maybe we just talk a little bit about that. Why is it that we have this global pandemic? In my lifetime, I can't remember a global pandemic like that. Well, we talk about the flu and epidemic in the early 20s, but I can't remember a severe pandemic like this one. Maybe any one of you has a comment on that? What's behind that?
Yes, Siggy, you mentioned already the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, and which really started a couple of years earlier. And one reason why we had also pandemics 100 years ago is the fact that people traveled. In this case, in this time, it was in the middle of the First World War. So ships, troop ships from the US traveled to Europe, brought soldiers to Europe. Soldiers from Europe, US soldiers, moved back to the US. So it was perfectly to distribute, to spread the virus. And of course, and everybody is knowing this, 100 years later, our so-called global world, we are global. We are traveling, and by traveling, the virus is traveling with us. And for SARS-CoV-2, for COVID-19, we will get infected, and then we have an incubation period, about 5 days. So where we do not develop disease symptoms, where we do not know that we are infected. Now we know because we have all the test system, but not a year ago. So people were spreading the virus all over the globe, not knowing that we're infected. And there are a lot of more reasons why we have pandemics, but I see the global spread is one of them.
And I think we will come back to that at the very end, because an obvious question is, how can you better be prepared if the expectation is there that we might experience that in the future more often, hopefully not as severe, but this is what we're going to talk about in the very end. So looking forward. But let's go back to our key topic of today. I mean, fighting the virus. I mean, that has been the major issue, finding the right therapeutics. What is the best way to attack these viruses? And maybe we just start with a more general aspect. Where are these creatures? Where can you get them? Where can you attack them? And I don't know who wants to start. Ralf, you want to say a few words on what are the points of, the experts say targets, but targets are intervention points for therapeutics. Maybe you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, of course you cannot get infected. So, I mean, that's the first barrier. Yeah. So try to isolate yourself. But this is not convenient. And so for sure, for an immunologist, the most important one would be to gain an immunological memory, and this by vaccination. And so this would lead to antibodies, which detects virus when they enter the body. And before entering the cell, so you already mentioned that the virus needs to enter a cell for replication. And by neutralizing antibodies, you delete the virus before they were able to enter the cell. So this is one of the most effective ways to have a sterile immune response. And the other option would be, on the one hand, after infection, to get a therapeutic. Could be a T-cell response, for example. A T-cell can detect infected cells and eliminate these kind of cells, or to have a antivirostatic, a drug, for example, when it's really acute infection. So these are our barriers and our weapons to fight the virus before and after infection, I would say.
So just to summarize that, and I think that's very important. The major concept behind the therapy should be to activate the body's own immune system to really, specifically attack this virus. And we come to some more specific explanation. And I think this is why we talk a lot about vaccines in that context, right?
Yes.
However, what you also pointed out is using the vaccination strategy is mostly good for people to prevent them from a virus infection, right?
Yeah.
But as we see, we do have a lot of infected people that are ill, that are seriously ill. And this is, I think, where Oliver comes in also, because vaccination as a prevention concept is not helping us in the acute phase that we also see. So that's why I thought it would be very helpful if we have both these streams on the panel. And Oliver, you might just want to jump in, and because you come from a company, Atriva, that especially has an approach to treat diseased people.
Yeah, exactly. But let me start with the following. It's in my personal view, it's vaccination is a first choice, but it's vaccination not always work. For example, there's one vaccine for measles, and to be honest, you will not find a company which will develop an antiviral drug against measles because we have a very, very good working vaccine against this. On the other hand, HIV, we have done efforts to develop a vaccine. We failed, but we have a very, very good antiviral drug since 1995. And this shows the broad spectrum. One virus where a vaccine perfectly works, another virus where the vaccine is not working, but the antiviral drug is working. So this is the spectrum. And now coming back to COVID-19, here we are so far luckily that the vaccines we have so far and which were developed in fastest time ever. This was a great achievement of science to develop a vaccine in, let's say, 1 year and a quarter. So this is good, but the virus, and you all know this, changes. And this is the point where we need then antiviral drugs. Not all of the people can be vaccinated because of different reasons. This is the point where
I hope we have him back.
Okay, even though vaccination is the first choice, we definitely need antiviral drugs. And for COVID-19, and Ziggy, this is why you asked me particular what we are doing for COVID-19. I think it's not the best thing to target the virus directly. You need something to target, which targets the virus, but also the overwhelming immune response after virus infection. And this overwhelming immune response, this demonstrates the severity of disease. So you need both. You have to fight against the virus and also modulate the immune response. And this is the target, or this is the aim of Atriva Therapeutics.
Adam, just bringing you in again. I mean, you are a physician by training, right? Is that true? So you also have a view on both these approaches. So what's your take there?
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what both Ralf and Oliver discussed. I think in many diseases, the vaccine is often the best because, of course, you'd like to prevent infection in the first place. And particularly for acute infections, so which in most cases COVID-19 is, by the time someone actually comes to the hospital and is really sick, a lot of the damage from the virus has already happened. And so even the best drug against the virus sometimes doesn't make a big difference for that patient. Often does. And then we've seen that some of our drugs actually work best by working on the patient's immune system and how it responds to the virus. But I think the drug angle is also important, as Oliver suggested, because there are some people who the vaccine doesn't work well for. We've noticed, of course, that people who have certain conditions that affect their immune system don't respond as well to the vaccine as everyone else, and we need to have something for them too. And so I think that's where it's really shows how we need both these development in both these areas to really be able to provide the best outcomes for the most people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll go back. We come back to the specifics of the vaccines as well as on the drugs. There are various approaches on both ways. But one thing, when we talk about the vaccines at the moment, it's really a big competition between the so-called vector vaccines and the mRNA vaccines. Right. That's the first thing where we should briefly probably touch on. Because also in the general discussion in the society, there has been a lot of, well, I would call it miscommunication, which one is better, which one has disadvantages and advantages. Maybe it's helpful for the audience really to hear the experts a little bit about, what the efficacy is. Is there this issue of, vector vaccines being very different to the mRNA vaccines? Maybe you want to address this a little more in more detail. Who wants to start? Ralf, you want?
Yes, I can start. Yes, true. So what we saw now with the COVID-19 vaccines or vaccines against COVID-19 is really the upcoming of mRNA technology. And so it was really a great work, one have to say. But I mean, especially here in Germany, we also have to recognize that the vaccines that are based on viral vectors from Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca works quite efficient. But there were a lot of miscommunication. On the one hand, AstraZeneca made some mistakes by communication, by also putting their vaccine a bit too early on the market, I would say, with not perfectly structured clinical trials. And this led to a lot of confusion. And then there were reports around with 60, 70, 80% efficacy, which really confused the people a lot. And in addition, I think it was also a disaster how they served the vaccines to the European Union and to Great Britain, for example. And there are a lot of frustration on both sides occurred, and this led to a really, I would say, an unfair estimate of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And also, if you have a look on Johnson & Johnson, so this is the only vaccine that elicits a good protective immune response by a single shot. And however, one have to really recognize and say that the mRNA vaccines are more efficient than AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. But there is also another one from Novavax, which is a protein-based vaccine, which is really an old technology, which showed up to now the best efficacy in clinical trials, with above 95%. So, and it's not only the technology, I would say, it's also the mindset. And this is also when I have why the mRNA technology leads the vaccine field. So their mindset was really to be prepared, and to really push their technology forward. And this is, at least in my opinion, why the big pharma company failed and have not delivered the vaccine. So Moderna, I think Moderna has applied for clinical study in February last year. So I most of us did not know that there's a virus out there, and they have applied for a clinical trial. So this is amazing. And so it's a combination of technology, of pioneers' work, and excellence, but also of the mindset.
I think that also leads to a discussion we will have a little later. The role of biotech as, in this case, kind of the innovation engine. And on the other side, the role of the big pharmas, who, as you just said, were just not the initiators of this innovation path. But I go back to Adam, maybe also from the US perspective. Is there a similar discussion on the vector and the mRNA vaccines and their usefulness or not? Because, we have in Germany, we had a very critical discussion around Astra. And I think this really held up the whole vaccination process quite a bit. We would be probably a little further along the way. So what's your perspective from the US side on that?
There was quite a bit of discussion in February or March about which is the best one, what should we be doing? And I think the real hard thing to get across is it's from a strictly speaking, you can't really compare. they're obviously different vaccines, and you can't look at one trial and the results and 90% effective or whatnot, and another and it's 80% effective for another vaccine. The saying in the U.S. is you're comparing apples and oranges. They're both fruit, but they're very different. And to really know how the relative efficacy of a vaccine, you have to compare them in the same trial, one against another, which of course hasn't been done. And all these trials were done in different parts of the world when different genetic variants have been around, different patient populations. All of those things can affect how well a vaccine works in a study. So, I think it's been very hard to sort that out, and certainly very hard to message that, that uncertainty to the greater public. I think there is a sense among people that the mRNA vaccines are unbelievably effective, and we've gotten used to that really high number, and it can make all the other ones look bad, but the other ones are amazing as well. And so I think it's just been challenging. And there was a lot of discussion about in the U.S. In the late winter about, well, who gets the J&J vaccine and who gets an RNA vaccine, and how are you being fair, and who gets what in the United States. Right now, the vast majority of people are getting the mRNA vaccines, either the Pfizer, Biontech, or the Moderna ones. But there's a fair bit of J&J vaccine usage, and AstraZeneca, for a number of reasons, has been challenging in the U.S. In terms of the rollout, in terms of production and things like that. But my view is that, and then as the Novavax, as Ralf mentioned, and then they all are quite good, certainly better than our flu shots in terms of how well they work. And I think that should be the message.
I think that's an interesting point. I remember we had the discussion here in Germany for quite a while in the beginning, right? mRNA is something new. Can you trust on something new? Yeah. Can it be really as good as the old mechanism of making vaccines, like the vector vaccines, of course, right? And it totally flipped around after a while, after this kind of messages came up with Astra and others.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think the key sentence you said is that all these vaccines, whatever mechanism they have in their making, are effective enough and are far more effective than everybody is satisfied with the flu vaccines.
I bring up, if you can think back to September 2020, when the U.S. FDA said, okay, what's going to be our benchmark for moving a vaccine forward for COVID-19? They said 50%. And flu vaccine almost never reaches that in any flu season. And 50% was going to be their benchmark. And then all of a sudden in October, November, the mRNA vaccines show 90%. And all of a sudden we're like, well, 90%, we got to get 90%, something. And so J&J comes in with, high 70s, low 80%. And everyone's like, oh, it's a terrible vaccine. It's way better than the 50% benchmark. And so we've just, another expression is we've moved the goalposts in terms of what we're expecting from this, based on the success story.
But I think, just to summarize this, also for our audience here, I think we should really point out, all the experts here, that all the existing and marketed vaccines work. It's always, that's my opinion, better to get vaccinated rather than, trying to pick one or the other vaccine and not getting vaccinated by the other, which we do have quite a lot if you listen to people. I always try to convince them, don't look at the 85, 95, 94 percentages. They all work. And I think this is the statement that we should really point out here.
Yeah,
but
definitely. Especially they all work to hinder severe diseases. So maybe there are some mild cases, but no fatal cases or severe illnesses.
Yeah.
And I just want to add one thing. So of course, we in our Western world, for us, it's only about the efficacy, because for us, it's no issue to see a doctor twice. It's no issue to pay 20 euros instead of 3 euros for vaccine. And we have the power to order and get delivered, But this is a global pandemic, and in other countries, it's totally different. So there, it's not able to see a doctor twice. So therefore, Johnson & Johnson might be the only chance to get a vaccination, efficient vaccination, or it's really a cost issue if the vaccine dose is 3 euros or 20 euros. And so taking this into account, I think it's more than important to have not only one technology, but to have technologies that really overlaps and also covers all demands from different perspectives and from all over the world.
Yeah, and I think part of that discussion also includes something I don't want to focus on right now. The stability. Do we need a cold chain in order to get to more distant places and so forth? So I think you're very right. We can be more than happy that we have that many different choices on the market already, and many more, obviously, also in development. Some people might think, why do we need additional vaccines that are still lagging behind? Like, for instance, also the CureVac development in Tübingen. I think it is very important that we do have even more. And this brings me to a next point, which of course has to do with just that discussion also. We're talking a lot about these days about variants, right? And I think this is another very, very important issue to be discussed, especially around the different vaccines, how they tackle with different variants. And maybe you can bring us into that discussion a little bit. Who wants to start? Oliver, I come back to the drugs in a minute. Don't worry.
Sure. I'm waiting.
Who wants to start, Ralf or Adam? About talking a little bit about variants. What's the situation out there? How do the current vaccines address them? And Ralf, I think maybe we let Adam start because you have a different approach, especially looking into future developments of these viruses. Because what is clear, and Adam, I think you alluded to that in the beginning, is that they do change, they do mutate, and this, opens another challenge.
Yeah, so of course, variants have been very in the news, at least in the US, since probably December. And I'm sure in Europe as well with this B.1.1.7, the now called Alpha. By the WHO. There's probably 3 or 4 main variants now that the WHO has determined variants of concern. And each one is different. They're concerning for different reasons. And so B.1.1.7 or Alpha was kind of the first big one, and it appears to spread more quickly. The data are accumulating that it's pretty well covered by the vaccines, that even though it's very different from other SARS-CoV-2s, that the vaccine seems to work almost as well as some of the other variants. It does appear that the vaccines might not be as effective. They still appear to be quite effective. I mean, the data is still coming in. They certainly don't work. They don't not work. So maybe the vaccine would go from 80% effective to down to 70% effective. So I think the key message is the variants, probably some of them will affect how well the vaccine works, but there appears to be this buffer that the vaccines work well enough, and as Ralf indicated, they certainly prevent severe disease, and so that the variants are something to follow. But up until now, it doesn't appear that it's like a light switch that it all of a sudden makes the vaccine completely ineffective. It just might, make them a little less effective, and maybe even so, it doesn't appear like people will still get as severe disease with the variants. But it's something that's going to be followed moving forward for sure, because there's going to be new variants, and we're going to have to keep an eye on it to see whether the vaccine needs to be changed eventually in the future.
Maybe one additional question for you, Adam. If we increase now the percentage of people being vaccinated, doesn't this increase the pressure on the mutation rate?
Yeah, there's been a lot of
Is that a realistic fear that more variants will show up just upon this increased pressure?
I think that's a reasonable idea. I would say it probably, I think the benefit of the vaccine still outweighs the risk of potentially selecting for new variants. And the reason is, the more people who are vaccinated, fewer people are going to be infected. And there are fewer people who are going to be infected, there's fewer chances for the virus to mutate. The virus can only mutate inside a person. And so by reducing the number of cases, and that's not just in Germany or the US, that's all over the world, we need to get vaccines out, because by reducing the burden of the virus, we'll reduce the chances for it to evolve. It will always evolve, it will always find a way. But if you cut off enough of those opportunities, you can really slow things down. And I think that's what we need to do.
Okay, and so now Ralf, I think your approach is a different one, which also has to do with the variant story, I guess, right? Because so far, all the vaccines we know are really addressing the spike protein as a single target, right? And maybe you want to talk a little bit about this and other options that you pursue.
Yes. So, yeah, sure. So we have a kind of a different approach, as we are tackling not only the spike protein, we are tackling also other antigens from the coronavirus. And so the idea behind this was to prevent mutation and evasion of this viruses by fighting the viruses on different frontiers. And so that was our idea, and the ministry commissioned us in April last year to build like a fallback option or fallback vaccine in case that the other vaccines are not able to prevent infection and to deliver protection against virus infection, because in April last year it was not totally clear what's the prime correlate of infection. Is it only antibodies? Is it only antibodies against spike proteins? Are T cells important or not? And so we take into account that this concept and generated a vaccine that has encoded different antigens from the coronavirus. And indeed, we really see that it is a benefit, that also the immune response against the spike protein benefits from the other epitopes of the corona vaccine, which triggers T cell responses too. And so this is really nice that this in theory works, but now we have to bring it into humans. So this is our major challenge. So we see in preclinical studies that it's super effective, at least as effective as the mRNA technologies. But now the next step, and this is really untouched land for us, is to get the vaccine in a clinical trial and then to the market. And so this is the major challenge for us.
Well, but I still, you are pretty early in your development, right? So it will take a while, and we'll come to the timelines in a minute, but it will still take a while until you are close to the market or even have market entry. And still, I think you are very motivated to follow up on that track, because as I said a little earlier, we will need these different types of vaccines, also including addressing different targets and different antigens of the virus. I think this is something that has been learned from really doing a lot of research into this. Yeah. So coming back to you, Oliver, again. So we don't want to talk about vaccines only. I think we have already talked about the drug necessity. Why do we need drugs also in addition to vaccines? It's something that is complementary rather than in a competition, as you also pointed out. And it's both actually addressing immunological topics along the way of where the virus really goes and comes into this infection. But if we look at the developments of therapeutics, of drugs outside vaccines, there has been a lot of different ideas. It started with repurposing. Maybe you can explain that part, and then maybe come to the point where you are as Atriva, and where other competitors in this area of the drugs are heading for.
Okay. Yes, certainly I will. So let me start with some calculations. And as Adam has pointed out already, flu vaccines, the effectiveness is below, Adam, as you said, below 50%. So, and in a normal flu season, at least I don't know the numbers for the US, but in Germany, if we get 50% of the population vaccinated for flu or motivated to get vaccinated, then we were doing a really good job. And this sums up with protection of 25% of the population, meaning that 75% are not protected in the flu season. In COVID-19, and because of the great effectiveness of the vaccines, it's certainly different. We have more people vaccinated, and as Adam and Ralf already mentioned, we are talking about 70 to 90%, which is far the best we ever had. So far for vaccination and numbers. So, but anyway, for COVID-19, and you have pointed out the variants and maybe some changes. So in this situation, there will be some situations where there is no vaccine either working or available, and you solely rely on drugs. And while the vaccine development, as was already pointed out, we had the mRNA, we had the vector vaccines. For drugs, a drug development, if you start from a chemist in a chemist lab until a drug you can buy in the pharmacy, it's if it works really fast, it will take you 8 years. It's 10 to 12 years is more appropriate. So what they had to do, people had to say whether all drugs that are already available for some like antiviral drugs working for them against some other viruses would also work against SARS-CoV-2. And this is called repurposing, using already existing drugs for a new purpose, repurposing. So this is where they started. And there was remdesivir, for example. They used remdesivir and as an antiviral drug, and unfortunately it was not so good. And they used other things. And until now, we have no really effective antiviral drug. What's the reason for this? The reason is very simply, the course of disease is the virus, because the virus infects the body, but it manipulates the immune system. And as I have said before, it's the overreaction of the immune system, the inflammation, that points out the severity of disease. Give me this example. Do you know Domino Day? This is where they have in big sports halls this domino pieces, and then you put the first piece, and everything is going on. So the virus is only the trigger of the domino pieces, and then all these domino stones are the immune reaction. And the virus is only a trigger. So if you start with a so-called direct antiviral, which only is effective in the early phase of the disease, you will never, ever cover the later stage, which is responsible for severity of disease symptoms. So this is why people then, after figuring out that direct acting antivirals will not work, started to treat severe COVID-19 patients with immunosuppressive agents like dexamethasone, which was given in the late stage in the disease in order to suppress the overwhelming immune response. It also didn't work so well because, as Ralf already pointed out, and this is why I really like Ralf's concept for his vaccine, is that he is also activating the cellular immune responses because we need this cellular immune response. If you immune suppress the whole immune system, you will not have a cellular immune response which can develop to a so-called memory response and therefore then fight against the virus. We need the T cells to fight against the virus, so immunosuppressive agents are also not working.
Okay, let's switch gear a little bit. We talked a lot about science now and medicine and treatment. I think we also should talk about business. And I think the most amazing thing, the most amazing story we have experienced, especially with these vaccine development, is the short timeline. Who would have imagined 2 years ago that within less than a year, there is efficacious treatment on the market? How could that happen? So maybe, Adam, you want to start?
I don't know how it happened. It's amazing.
So you are amazed as well.
I mean, I think we have some clues how it happened. I think, I remember early 2020, they were talking about, oh, it's going to usually takes, 5 to 10 years for a vaccine. Maybe we'll be able to, I think even Dr. Fauci, our, main infectious disease government scientist, was still saying a couple years, I think. And it's just amazing that it happened so quickly. I think we need, I always remind people that a lot of the progress was because there was already a lot of basic research and applied research out there, that mRNA vaccines didn't just materialize in January or February 2020, that people have been working on them for many years already. So the technology and the vectored vaccines as well had already matured. And so that allowed things to move very quickly. But I think we also need to acknowledge just how much public investment went into spurring these developments so quickly. Infusions of government money to really accelerate things, and then how I think my perception is industry worked very closely with governments to compress the timeline to meet all the regulatory benchmarks, but do it in a way that you kind of staggered development so that you didn't waste any time. You didn't cut corners, but you also didn't, there was an urgency in how things was getting done, and I think all that contributed.
I think it's two different things that you mentioned, and I think that's really helpful here. That on the one hand, we're talking about platforms, right, that had been researched on for a couple of years. If we look into companies like Biontech or Moderna, or also CureVac. CureVac is the RNA company as they define it. I mean, they've been working for, 15 years. And so it comes closer to the timelines we are used to, right? The question was also, can you apply it, the application that most of them had in other areas like oncology, for instance, can you apply it and can you switch the application to this virus disease? And I think this is one major point, how it could happen that it could be developed so fast. The other one also, I think we should really focus on that a little bit, is the various support from governments, because that's also, and that's part of our discussion, a bit different between Germany and the US. That the governments realized that in order to speed up the development, it needs some investment from the government side to these companies. Maybe also seen very critical at some point, but I think this is something we should really elaborate a little bit on. And maybe Ralf, you want to start?
Yeah, so definitely this was really a differentiator, that the government really invests in this company, because this allowed the companies to start activities that you would stagger in parallel, yeah, by taking full risk and not await result before starting the next stage and so on. And this was backed up by the government, financially backed up. And of course, this is then, it's easy to decide if you would book a manufacturing slot if it's fully paid by the government, yeah, or to build up a manufacturing plant if this is covered by the government. So this is really helping a lot and accelerating a lot. And but it's due to the pandemic. I cannot imagine that for future for future diseases it will be similar. And I think there is a reason why it should not be that in that way, because the company is an enterprise and they have to take their own risk. I think it was really good, and it was totally correct how they were financed and how they were supported. But for sure, this will change back again.
This is certainly something we will come to, because that's an obvious question. You know, now that you have experienced that speeding up of a development really significantly, how can you probably make this a more sustainable effort, especially since we do have a lot of diseases with a very high medical need, right? And so I think this is an obvious question. But before we go to that, maybe Adam, from the US perspective a little more. I mean, I think the US started with that kind of government support. You have this initiative, what is it, Warp Speed, right? And how is it different to what we started in Germany a little later? And come back to Oliver in a minute, because I have one thing in mind. But maybe Adam, you can talk a little bit about the US initiative and how that worked.
Yeah, I think I'm not well versed on all the details of how Warp Speed worked, but essentially, I mean, it worked on multiple levels. So the Moderna, vaccine actually went into trials as a partnership of sorts with our National Institutes of Health, which is our government research institute. And so there was Moderna is a in the scope of things, smallish biotech, not anymore. But they work together with the government, to do the late stage development of the vaccine. But then the government also, as Ralf indicated, kind of de-risked some of the late development process. I mean, these these trials with 40,000 people are quite expensive, and that's often takes a couple of years of investment for a large company to run. And the government essentially provided guarantees that they'll buy this much vaccine, and that there will be a market for it if successful, which kind of took some of the element of risk out of running some of these trials, if a company is going to, go that far. And then I think also, as Ralf indicated, the purchasing power and kind of these advanced contracts to purchase doses. So the government essentially, as I understand it, essentially placed a bunch of bets. They said, well, or hedged their bets. They're going to, buy a bunch of doses of all these different types, thinking that one of them is going to, pan out and work. They all worked. But, by saying, okay, we're gonna buy these many doses. If you prove this works, we're gonna buy this many doses. A company can go ahead, and they'll have a market, and so that helps. And so I think that was another thing. And then it allowed them, as Ralf indicated, to set up production facilities, right? It's one thing to develop your vaccine, but if you've got to produce millions of doses, you need to have a bunch of production facilities ready to go. And so the government, had contracts and invested in helping along those ways. And so all those things took a lot of the risk of this late stage development from the companies. And so I think if you were running one of these companies, it would be a easy call to go ahead and really push forward. Because there was a tremendous downside, to moving forward. And so I think that's, the way this, I think in retrospect, it worked pretty well. You could come up with scenarios where maybe it would have been a bad idea and maybe it wouldn't have worked. And, certainly at the time, I'm sure there was some concern, but right now it's looking like a phenomenally good idea.
Yeah, I think that the major topic is de-risking, and you both alluded to that.
Yeah.
And I think this is also here kind of the responsibility of a government, right? In order to deal with the pandemic, develop a treatment as fast as possible. That's an issue of the society, right? And I think it justifies what has happened in terms of investing to de-risk. And so I think this is still also for future considerations, also always a discussion: where does a government really interacts with a company? Because purely it's business that the companies have, right? And we have the discussion right now whether patents should be lifted in this case in order to have global distribution or that. So it's an interesting discussion. But as I understand from both of you, is that the de-risking concept of these governments was a very important way in order to speed up the whole process. Yeah, sorry, Ralf, you wanted to say something?
So this is most likely the most important issue, but I think the other issue was really the regulatory bodies, so and also how they interact or support the vaccine developers, and most likely also how they were able to be a bit more flexible than in a usual case. And I think this is also something that we should consider for our future developments. If our market and our regulatory framework is a bit over-regulated. So I think this is also one of the key drivers why it was able to accelerate the vaccine development in that way.
Well, this could also be discussed differently if we just compare the US and Germany for the regulatory bodies, as you mentioned, right? I think we still have in Germany this 100% mentality. We want to be 100% secure, safe, that everything works like it is expected to work, right? Whereas in the US, I have the feeling that sometimes it was more pragmatic. We have to get as fast as possible to vaccinate as many people as possible. Am I right? Am I wrong, Adam?
I can't speak for the entire United States, but I mean, I'm sure there are, for lack of a better term, cultural differences and how to approach these complex problems. And of course, there's disagreements in the U.S. about the right way, but yeah, I suppose there was a little bit of a different mentality about it. Neither right nor wrong. Just things are different, and our government works differently and has worked differently through the pandemic, I think, than certainly in Europe.
Coming back to the government support, Oliver, I know you're coming from the drug side. You kind of complained, and I mean rightfully complained, that this government support was really solely focusing on vaccines, right? At least with the majority of the money going into that field. That was different in the US, where Warp Speed is really addressing both vaccines and therapeutics. And no wonder we have this magic cocktail that, was given to former president and, made him getting away very fast. Oliver, maybe you have a comment on that and how you see that government support overall.
Yeah, it's let me catch up with the discussion where we started de-risking, and I would go even one more step back. We have small companies, mid-sized companies, and we have big pharma companies. And saying that the innovative step, let's say it this way, this came from the smaller companies and from the mid-sized companies, not from big pharma. And a small company, they have their budget. They have their budget plan. They may be VC-driven companies, and they don't have the financial power to change gears, to change the direction, to now say, okay, now we are doing COVID-19 and we have enough money. So government support is very important for de-risking, as Ralf and Adam have pointed out, but it's also to give a small company the financial flexibility. It needs to go in a new development direction. This is the first point. And yes, as the CSO of a company that develops a therapeutic, a drug against the disease, I was not so happy that the government support in the first run was solely on vaccines, but from the hierarchy. And this is, as I have pointed out in the really beginning of our discussion, vaccines are the first choice, and consequently, they have to support it first, which they did. And now we have in the second run, and it's not a secret, the BMBF, the German Ministry for Science and Education, they supported antiviral drug development, and the company Atriva also was supported by this program. And there is also from another ministry in Germany now a huge grant program out. So yes, now the German government is supporting antiviral drug development from the phase 2 and also phase 3 clinical development step. And this is the right way to do. And we also, also the government has now a big plan for pandemic preparedness, because we all are aware that maybe this coronavirus was not the last virus that is hitting us, and there are some new ugly bugs knocking at our door, which are, for example, the viruses from the virus families, the dengue, the West Nile viruses. And therefore, we need a pandemic preparedness. And also in this line, government is now supporting us.
Well, we'll come back at the end to the preparedness. I mentioned that in the beginning. Before we do that, I should really. Oh, there's one question coming up. It's also about the preparedness. I'll come back to that question. I just wanted to motivate the audience and people listening to us. Really, put your questions in the chat. I check every once in a while, but I haven't seen anything. So if anything pops up, please don't be shy. We can take up some of the questions. There's one. See, yes, maybe that's a good one. We have these people that don't want to get vaccinated, the Impfgegner, as we say in Germany, and the question was about how can we convince those really to think differently, or do we understand? Can we understand why they think like that, or how their view comes about? What do you think? Maybe there's also different answers from both geographies.
So,
You want to start? Oliver, you want to start? Go ahead.
No, okay. Well, let me say it this way. This is a normal thing. We have our society is the Gaussian distribution curve. So we have people. They say a vaccine is a good thing. But we also have these so-called Impfgegner, which you say, I don't want to get vaccinated because I don't know. And we had all these constructs of rumors where they said, okay, Bill Gates is injecting something into you. So that's the whole bench, and this is reflecting a society. And yeah, and how you can convince them? I don't know whether you can convince them. I see, if you compare flu, where we need our annual flu shot, to now the hype. Now everybody, at least in Germany, Adam, I don't know how, because I think the US is much more ahead with the vaccination program. But it looked to me that when it was announced that if you are vaccinated, then you can go again in a beer garden like this, then everybody said, no, I need my vaccination. But seriously, it's now, yeah, but it's a run on. Everybody wants to go to an Impfzentrum and to get its COVID shots. But you will have a certain amount of people who will not be vaccinated, will be Impfgegner, and that's it. How you can change it, I don't know. I would say don't change them. If
this is true, what you say, and I think, yeah, the percentage of willingness is increasing, which is good. But the question is, will we really reach the herd immunity, as we would call it? And if I look at the actual numbers, I mean, the US was very fast in increasing at least the first vaccinations. The actual numbers are what I just found out yesterday. 52% got the first shot, but already 42% the second. So that's a pretty decent number. Compared to Germany, we have also 45% the first shot, which is not very much different from the US, but only 20% have the second shot. So the question is realistic. Will we reach that herd immunity? Because the US was much faster in the first phase of vaccination. They did it everywhere, right? Whereas we had to build up the centers and so forth, right? But what I heard, and maybe Adam, you can comment on that, is that there is quite some increasing hesitance now from various groups of people. And if I just look at the 52%, it should be much higher by now. Is that an indication that it's not going to happen with a herd immunity?
The way I look at it is we had this very rapid rise, right, in the percent of vaccine. What were they, 2 to 3 million a day, and in some degree that was on Oliver's curve, right? The people like me who took my my kid who, to get his vaccine the first day it was available in his age group, the very willing people. And then you start going to, people who are maybe a little more hesitant. But it's the low-hanging fruit that you get first. So you take off, and then you got to work harder, because then you've got to get, your pace is going to slow. I mean, they're still doing 1 to 2 million a day here in the U.S., and it's just that there's more focus now on reaching the people who aren't as easy to reach, who aren't as easy to convince, and coming up with new ways of getting them vaccinated. And I think I'm optimistic. I think we'll get to somewhere around 70%, which is our president's goal this summer. And but I do think that we're going to reach some sort of plateau at some point where, I guess, the inGegners, I think the way I see it, there are people who are hesitant, who are waiting, who are not sure. And those people, I think, are still reachable, and we can, work and convince them and get them vaccinated. There's going to be some population that you're never going to reach and are never going to want to do it. And no matter how good your persuasion, you're not going to get. But I don't think it's such a big group. I mean, I think a large number of people, will eventually get vaccinated. And I think when I talk to people, I'm like, well, what do you care about? And people care about not getting really sick and having their lives return back to normal, going to the beer garden, and kind of tying that to, well, the way to get there is to get as many people vaccinated as we can. And what are your concerns about getting vaccinated? And listen and try. And it's in the US, this has been talked about in terms of climate change, right? How do you reach people who don't believe in climate change? And it's, well, you ask them what's important to them, and then try to link that to climate change. And so I think the same sort of logic holds for reaching people with vaccines. And I think we'll get there, but it might not be as fast as we'd like.
My personal opinion is actually, at the moment we're talking about experts like you trying to convince these people. That might be hard, at least the last 10 or 20% that we talk about. However, I think what is much more convincing, the more people we get vaccinated. And we see the efficacy. On the one hand, we see no big side effects. I mean, it's very, very rare what we see. I think that's a much more convincing argument, between people who got vaccinated, who got not vaccinated, rather than always have the experts. At least in Germany, I think there is some normal skepticism as to what politicians would say, and maybe also what scientists would say. I would more believe in the people talking to each other. So that's my hope.
Your neighbors, and the people in your town. And in the U.S., we've switched from going to these big vaccination centers to a lot. They're starting to distribute to primary doctors' offices, right? Because people, they're not going to trust me as much as they're going to trust the doctor who sees them several times a year and listen to them and talk to them. So I think that's going to be the next stage.
I would have two more topics to address. In looking at the time, we will only make one. That's the preparedness thing. But before we do that, I will just briefly talk about the implication or the impact this whole Corona pandemic had on biotech as such. That's my field since 20 years. And I'm retired now. And the first year after retirement now, the numbers jumped up like hell. We had 3 billions of euros in financing of biotech this year, which had never happened in 20 years. And so there's a big boost for biotech. And of course, it's caused by companies, especially in Germany, involved in this whole story, like Biontech or CureVac also, and hopefully also PrimeVector in the future. I think that's a very good point. I'm not so sure. In the US, biotech has always been, at least in the last 7-8 years, in a hype period where it was recognized that this is a big innovation engine, right? And if you look at the capital markets and the financing systems, this had been very, very positive in the recent years. So I think there's a difference here between the US and Germany. We got a boost where we really have to ask ourselves, will it be sustainable? Or, will it go back as soon as this pandemic has been overcome? In the US, I think there's a much broader support and a much more empathy for biotech as the innovation engine. Maybe any one of you want to comment on that? Adam, you want to start? Not
Yeah, I mean, I
being
think,
a biotech guy, all right.
yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we've had much more of a biotech sort of culture
Yeah.
in the US for some time, and look, the money's going to go where people feel like, where investors feel there's an opportunity, right? And so I think it depends if, and then biotech is pretty diverse in itself, right? I mean, there's plenty of biotech that doesn't focus on vaccines or antiviral drugs. And so, yeah, I think it remains to be seen, is there continued investment in virus-related biotech? I suspect there will be. It might not be like it's been the past couple years, because that's probably not sustainable at that level. But I think there will be. But will it give a greater boost to biotech in general? I'm not sure. I think we talked earlier. I'm not sure 2 years from now if there's going to be the same urgency and the same interest, in this sort of area. We'll see.
I have really, my point was always we should use this momentum.
Mhm.
It's certainly a big momentum there at the moment, and it should be used in a broader sense to realize what biotech really does. Much broader than, as you just said, just vaccinations. But we're looking into energy, we're looking into climate, we're looking into other things where biotech is an important part. And my point is always to use this momentum now to really make it more known to the broader public. What kind of innovation is it bringing about in much broader fields than just the medicine and just the vaccinations? That's my personal opinion, at least, and that's why I hope it's not just a momentum, but that it's kind of more sustainable. But that's a hope. I might be too optimistic, but anyway. Okay, let's just go we have another 5 or 6 minutes to this point we mentioned a couple of times now. Everybody is clear that we might have to expect pandemics in the future. We talked about the global mobility in the very beginning. I think that's one of the major causes why we have to expect that. So the question is, how can we be better prepared? What have you learned from this pandemic in terms of being prepared for future pandemics? And will we then even be able to react even faster, that it might not be as severe as we just experienced? Who wants to start?
I would
Oliver,
like
go ahead.
I would like to start, and so I don't have a glass ball to look into it and see whether we in the future we will be more prepared and whether we will have learned something. But besides, and you have mentioned this, that we have the global mobility, we have, and you also have mentioned this already, we have the climate change, and with the climate change, this is where new viruses or even
Stay with us.
Move to our sites, and these are vectors for new viruses, and have pointed this out. This is the dengue and the West Nile virus and these kinds of viruses, and they are a real danger for or a source for future pandemics. And in this situation, and this is where we also as Atriva therapeutic company is focusing on, is this to develop a drug that acts as a broad spectrum antiviral. So this is our thing to tackle this challenge. And the other thing is lessons learned. And it's not only the biotech, it's not only the companies, it's also the society. We need in our health system lessons learned. So we have to be prepared also in these areas. And we will see in the future whether we have learned from this actual pandemic situation.
I think one major learning effect already is that we haven't had any significant flus this year. So just very simple hygienic things help, right? Yeah. And so wearing a mask like the Japanese do since years is obviously something very, very meaningful and has also to do with preparedness.
And this is really, we're really sorry for interrupting you, but this is what we will see in the end of the year, whether maybe when COVID should be gone by October, November, whether we are willing, at least Adam, I only can talk about Germany, whether we're willing to wear the mask in order to protect us against the flu season, influenza-like illness, viruses, and these kinds of things. This will be interesting. I don't know.
But it's also a price we pay for this, yeah. And I'm not sure if I'm willing to pay this price.
Wearing a mask?
Forever. So of course we can isolate ourselves, yeah, and or limit infection to really a low number, but so this goes along with our social life and social culture.
Yeah, but no, Ralf, wearing a mask in October, November, December, in January, when you're driving the bus, that's all. Like Siggy said, like the Japanese people doing this, and they're really successful.
Mm.
Well, let's go back to the preparedness. What's your take, Ralf?
I think there are a lot of lessons we learned, but I think we also navigated quite successful through this pandemic. Yeah, so we made it to vaccinate 50% of our people within 18 months. Yeah, so that's a great achievement. And preparedness, I mean, for vaccine developers, we also have a lot of lessons that we learned, and that's especially is that supply chain, for example, to have manufacturing capacities and so on. But for preparedness, I think I'm with Olli. So drugs that can be used for different diseases are really good to investigate further. Because as a vaccine company, you always have to know your enemies. For this kind of drugs that deliver us broader protection, it's not that strictly the case. And in addition, I would say most of the inventions comes from our basic research. And this is also why we should really strengthen the research at the university and these kind of institutes or institutions, because in the end it will bring us really towards better medicine, towards better biotech and to better preparedness.
I think what you're talking about is really something serious. If you look at the statistics in the recent decade, investments, including those in the pharmaceutical companies into infectious diseases, were really going back. We even had serious problems having enough and good enough antibiotics anymore. So I think this is one learning, maybe, that the infectious diseases is something that is becoming probably more important in the future. And so one learning is really that the fighting this pandemic now should be continued in order to be prepared. Right?
I want to share one sentence from Jose Esparza, and this is, so vaccines or the power of vaccines are that strong that it not only eradicates the disease, but only the memory to the disease. And I think that's totally true, not only for vaccines, but for infectious disease in Western world. Before this COVID pandemic, we were not used to live with serious infectious diseases. So we touch them every now and then, but they were not really in our mind. And this might have changed now.
So, Tim, your learning and your preparedness ideas.
Yeah.
Adam?
Yeah, I think I think we've seen how investment in research has really set us up to be so successful. I think with COVID in terms of the vaccines and to an extent the antivirals and or drugs more broadly. And so I think clearly maintaining that investment is important. I think the other parts of preparedness are, more societal and global. And I guess I'm a little more pessimistic on that realm. I mean, we've seen how, there were a lot of supply shortages early on in the United States, because we hadn't been stockpiling, things that we would need. And then I think a lot is going to depend on global cooperation, which I think presents a lot of challenges, right? I mean, pandemics require, cooperation among governments. And that has not been, a bright point in this pandemic. And so I hope we can learn, or at least figure out a way to be better prepared in that realm, because I think that's an area where I think some weaknesses have been shown in the last year. It's hard to imagine, the U.S. and Europe doing much better than we did in terms of, how quickly the response has been. But we still have a lot to do in the rest of the world, and I'm not at all convinced if another pandemic started somewhere in the world that we would be on top of it as quickly as we would need to be to contain it in the future. And so that's going to require a lot of work.
Okay, thanks very much. I have to make a stop here because we are running over time, but I would just like to finish with every one of you just taking up a question that came also in. And it says, how do you see the future years in regard to COVID? How will it affect our lives, society, long term? Maybe we take this as a question for each of you, just as the final outlook, final statement. Make it brief so that we don't go too much over time. But let's see. Adam, you want to start?
I think long term, I think COVID's going to be with us for good. I think in the U.S. at least, it's not going to be like it's been the past year. It's going to be not, maybe like a bad flu year. There'll be people who get sick, and there'll be people who die every year of this. But it won't be a society-stopping event that it's been. And I think, some of probably the bigger questions is how, like Oliver and Ralf were saying, like, how is it going to change how we behave? Those I have no ideas, in terms of, are we going to be wearing masks? Are we going to be, changing the way we work? Things like that. I don't really have a sense for that, but I think we are very close to kind of getting back to just living with this disease now, moving forward in a more manageable way. That's how I see it.
Ralf, you want to continue?
Yes, I totally agree with Adam's view. So at least I hope that we will have our usual life back within the next 3 to 6 months. But it will be exciting if our attitude changed back to our attitudes before the pandemic, and how long we need. Yeah. So me personally, I see that I'm a bit changed. Yeah. So my attitudes are changed, and I'm not totally convinced if this will get back to the attitudes before COVID-19.
Oliver, you want to?
Yeah. So I would say it's difficult, and as I mentioned before, I don't have a glass ball into it. So at least for Germany, what's certainly true is that the virus is now going for summer vacation. So, but what happens in, let's say, October? Is the virus coming back? And then it's already that what Adam and Ralf pointed out. This is really will influence it. We really do not know whether we will get in Germany a fourth wave because the virus is coming back. What's the chance that a virus can come back? Variation, mutated virus, it's coming back where maybe a vaccine is not working. I don't know. But the fact, and I would come back to financing from with government money again, because the government, at least in Germany, is supporting now a phase 2, phase 3 trial. They assume that the virus will last for a longer time, and we have to be prepared for future outbreaks.
Okay, I will just stop here, because otherwise I get blamed for taking too long. I thank you very much. I hope this has been interesting for our audience. If you have more questions, I think you should address those maybe via email to the organizers, and we'll make sure that you get answers. From my side here, I thank you very much on the panel. This was interesting talking to you. And I think it's a topic that will not leave us for the next month. And so I think it's good that we have addressed at least a few aspects, maybe also touched on a few points that have not been discussed in every corner of the world so far. So I hope it was interesting to the audience. And with that, I can only wish that we get away from this during this summer. It seems I'm pretty optimistic, and that we will have a different autumn this year, and hopefully also a very different winter. And talking about the preparedness, my hope would also be that we will even better deal in the future, because there are some learnings as we have seen in our discussion. So thanks a lot for all of you. And from my side, a good evening for everybody, and thanks for listening, and thanks for viewing.